Hello again, everyone. My name is Michael Jones. This week we're going to look at public and private universities to answer a question asked by Graham Allison regarding the difference between public and private managers and public and private governments and organizations in Are They Alike in All Unimportant Respects? So higher education is not specifically a government. However, we do provide education as a service, as a public service in this country, especially at the primary school level. We provide a free public education funded by taxpayers, and there's also some private alternatives to this. And then in higher education, public universities are what are called state universities. These are the UCs and the Cal States, which are funded and structured according to state guidelines and are overall very focused on providing a quality education to a more diverse population, provide an equal opportunity to attend the college, and have a wider range of degrees to offer, and is generally more affordable, and their funding comes from different sources and things like that. CBU is a good example of a private university that, in addition to providing quality education and four-year college courses, they're able to support a secondary agenda and conduct business differently. For example, as their mission statement says, to provide training for Baptist youth and others in actually training for ministry and things of that nature, and spreading a Christian worldview, which is just some of the differences, and there's quite a few other differences that we'll come to see between public and private universities. Overall, I find the public and private universities to be similar yet different, and we definitely know that there's going to be a lot of similarities in public and private universities. We know that pretty much any university that's accredited has the ability to provide degrees, and you get the education in a very similar manner, and a lot of things about it are going to feel very similar whether it's a public or private university. And Graham Allison summarized the similarities between public and private managers and public and private organizations in the general management aspects that are relatively uniform and universal in both sides. And the example that he pointed to in his article to just lay that out is with Luther Gulick's 7 functions, the POSCORB, and talking about the organizational structure and the budgeting. Those types of things are the functions that managers are going to deal with evenly on both sides. Where he finds the differences and the conclusion that he sort of comes to in his article, which I felt held pretty strong in this case, despite how similar things can be. I think what he said is relevant, and what he said is public and private management are at least as different as they are similar, and that the differences are more important than the similarities. And I would go further in this example to talk about some of the specific things that are different in state universities versus private universities that are different and that are representative of some of the concepts that Allison is talking about in his article, such as tuition is generally different. Generally, it's more affordable because of the dynamics at play, and that has to do with Allison's measurement of performance characteristic as well as his bottom line, which are things that he pointed out as differences in between public and private. There's also the class sizes and the number of degree offerings, which tends to vary between public and private. I cited this as personnel constraints, and this has to do with the political pressures at play that factor into decision making, and therefore spell out what the offerings are going to be at that institution. And then I also, as an additional theme, picked demographics and other differences, which demographics tend to be more diverse, as I mentioned, and the ability to have secondary agendas. Those are key differences, and that is representative of Allison's equity and efficiency, which is another area where there's difference between the public and private manager that we'll go into a little more detail. On the left here is just a picture of Graham Allison, and on the right hand side that's a picture of Cal Baptist's Board of Trustees, which I just thought was notable because when you're thinking of the private scenario, you're thinking of the shareholder type perspective, and when you're thinking of public, you're thinking more of the agency and managerial perspective and things like that. So as I mentioned, tuition is something that varies in public and private universities. It's generally a little more affordable in public universities because they are funded differently and there's less private contribution, and they receive a lot of state grants and state funding to provide education, and therefore it's dispersed more equitably among the population, and there's a lot of in-state tuition students as a result of that. From a general public administration standpoint, I thought of Taylor and Gulick because Taylor was known for his scientific viewpoint that there is the one best way to do things, and Gulick had his management principles, which do apply in this case, as with any public entity, we're looking for a systematic way of doing things and providing that service. I also noted here that this also is relevant to our understanding of federalism and the Constitution and Bill of Rights. We have the 10th Amendment that delegated powers not reserved for the United States to be reserved to the states or the people. And then we also have the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause, which has been interpreted as a means of providing a free education. And those are just some of the factors that highlight how tuition and measurements of performance can be different in public and private. We can see clearly that the objective is different, and another thing Allison said was financial return, market share, and performance measures for executive compensation are well established in private business, but those performance measures are not as readily apparent for public managers because of the fact that they are subject to a more broad sense of reasoning and need for their purpose. And so this is another one of those areas that there is going to be some difference between public and private. Another theme of difference that I can point to is the classroom size and degree offerings in public and private universities. Public universities tend to have on average, higher class sizes. That's understandable considering that it's a public entity and there's more in-state tuition, and they tend to offer more degree offerings because they are more focused on providing the greatest amount of opportunity and the greatest amount of utility for things that are useful for students to be successful and things that will positively benefit the greater good of the country overall. And I correlated this to one of Allison's aspects of personnel constraints and persuasion and direction, and he's referring to the sometimes political and other pressures that tend to bear down on the public manager when making decisions. And here we have a picture of Wilson, who had the dichotomy and felt that the administrators needed to be away from the strife of the political process. But we do know that in our democratic system that those things have to be responsive to one another and have to work together on some level in order to make the progress, in order to execute the policy. And that is relevant to the difference between what the public manager or the public university is going to be dealing with in terms as opposed to what the private manager, who is more beholden to his direct superior and to a directive of a profit motive in order to just streamline processes to complete their mission, whatever that may be, and to increase profitability. And I also felt that the systems theory was relevant to this particular thing because the systems theory from Katz and Kahn is talking about how, rather than Taylor's one best way scientific method, rather the organization is an open system. The process is subject to fluctuating inputs, and the means to get to the outputs and different feedback is going to constantly be in more of a state of flux, and there's going to be permeable environmental factors that are going to be regularly taken into account, and there's going to be a more fluid overall process. And I just think that that illustrated what I'm referring to here when I talk about constraints and persuasion and direction in a public versus a private setting. And we can see that it really is true that the systems theory does do a great job of highlighting what the public manager is experiencing. The last theme I want to point to is demographics and other differences. In the public setting, the demographics tend to be much more diverse, and that's by intention. And some of those other differences is that secondary agenda I was referring to earlier. In the private setting, it's okay to have more women or more Christians or something like that they feel is part of what their purpose is, and that's perfectly fine. But obviously in the public setting, they are taking more public funding and they're structured more from a state law perspective, and so they have to be more focused on providing that education regardless of those kinds of factors. So it's just another difference that we can see how that might be something that would be different for a student in terms of getting placed into a public versus a private school, for example, going by other criteria besides just their GPA and things like that. And it's definitely a trade-off, and it's just another thing that Allison is showing us here. In management, great emphasis tends to be placed on providing equity, while in private business, greater stress is placed on efficiency and competitive performance. And that's that goal, that underlying goal that we are talking about for the private university. I definitely think that Allison is telling us that no matter how similar things can be, they are definitely different. In a lot of, even in unimportant respects, they're still different. So overall, I added Riddle and Weber here to talk about wicked problems. There's been a number of wicked problems cited in education. Things like, how do we make tuition costs more affordable? What's the best curriculum? A lot of pressing issues that are difficult to solve. Public universities fill a lot of that gap, and sometimes private universities are stepping in to innovate and provide things in a different way. So there's partnership, and there's a certain amount of give and take, and the solutions are not easy, but there's different approaches on both sides. And we know that our federalism and our marble cake cooperative federalism plays a big factor in this. When I mentioned about funding and incentives from the federal government to try to influence state policy and so forth, a lot of that is happening nowadays, and it's a state and local issue in a lot of cases, but regardless, things are going to be different from the public and private perspective, and these are some of the different things that Allison and all these theorists have been talking about. And it's we're talking about the change from the 1960s and 70s from the earlier theorists, and we're definitely seeing how we're moving away from some of the older scientific principles, and we're getting more into the different ways that we can be effective in government. And this was just an example I thought really showed how there's kind of a lot of ways you can really look at it and see that managers are dealing with different pressures in the different public and private sides of things. Thanks for listening.